What if the groundbreaking first Sub-Saharan African film to gain international recognition was secretly based on a real suicide, featured a seamstress who made her own costumes, and introduced a filmmaking technique called cigarette butt cinema? Ousmane Sembène's 1966 masterpiece, Black Girl, hides dark secrets about its tragic inspiration, bizarre production methods, and shocking real-life aftermath that will leave you stunned by what happened both on and off camera. Fact 1. Based on a real suicide. When director Ousmane Sembène sat down to write his groundbreaking film Black Girl in 1966, he wasn't creating a fictional story from his imagination. Instead, he was adapting a real tragedy that had shocked him 8 years earlier when he read about it in a French newspaper while working as a docker in Marseille. The film was directly inspired by the actual suicide of a 31-year-old Senegalese woman named Diouana Gomis, who had traveled from her home in Boutoupa, Ziguinchor, Senegal to work as a domestic servant for a wealthy French family in Antibes, France. The real Diouana arrived in Antibes in April of 1958, full of hope for a better life and dreams of experiencing French culture. She had been hired in Dakar as both a maid and nanny, expecting to care for children and enjoy the sophisticated lifestyle she imagined France would offer. However, her reality became a nightmare of isolation, overwork, and humiliation that lasted less than 3 months. In July of 1958, unable to bear her circumstances any longer, she took her own life by cutting her throat. What made this tragedy even more heartbreaking was how it was reported in the French press. Diouana's death was reduced to a brief item in the newspaper's Fates Divers section, which was reserved for short, sensational news stories. The coverage was cold and clinical, treating her death as nothing more than an unfortunate incident without exploring the deeper issues of racism, exploitation, and colonial attitudes that had contributed to her despair. This dismissive treatment of her story deeply disturbed Sembène, who recognized that Diouana's experience represented the struggles of countless African workers who had been lured to France with false promises. Sembène transformed this real-life tragedy into his powerful debut film, ensuring that Diouana's story would be told with the dignity and complexity it deserved, rather than being forgotten as a mere newspaper footnote. Fact 2. Cigarette butt cinema was born. Director Ousmane Sembène created one of the most colorful terms in film history when he invented the phrase mégatage, which translates to cigarette butt cinema in English. This wasn't just a clever nickname, but a serious description of the desperate, resourceful filmmaking methods that African directors had to use during the 1960s to get their movies made. The term was Sembène's playful twist on the word montage, but it perfectly captured the reality of African cinema production, where every scrap of material and every penny had to be carefully saved and reused, just like someone collecting cigarette butts to make new cigarettes. The concept of cigarette butt cinema emerged from Sembène's own bitter experience trying to fund Black Girl and his other early films. Unlike Hollywood directors who had major studio backing or European filmmakers who could access government funding programs, African directors faced enormous financial obstacles that seemed almost impossible to overcome. They had to be incredibly creative and resourceful, finding ways to shoot films with practically no money while still maintaining professional quality and artistic vision. Sembène often said that African filmmakers were ready to sleep with the devil or she-devil to get the funding they needed to make their films, showing just how desperate the situation had become. The cigarette butt cinema approach meant using whatever equipment they could borrow, shooting in real locations instead of expensive sets, working with non-professional actors who would work for very little money, and stretching every aspect of production to its absolute limit. This resourcefulness became a defining characteristic of early African cinema, forcing directors to develop innovative techniques that actually enhanced their storytelling rather than limiting it. Sembène's term became widely adopted throughout the African film community, and even today, independent filmmakers around the world use cigarette butt cinema methods when they need to create something meaningful, despite having almost no budget to work with. Fact 3. The lead actress made her own costumes. When Mbissine Thérèse Diop appeared on screen as Diouana in Black Girl, audiences had no idea that nearly every piece of clothing she wore was actually made by her own hands. This wasn't a creative choice by the costume department or an artistic decision by the director, but rather a practical necessity born from the film's extremely limited budget. Diop, who was 27 years old at the time of filming, worked as a professional seamstress and dressmaker in Dakar, Senegal, and she used these real-world skills to solve one of the production's biggest challenges. According to interviews Diop gave many years later in 2016, she personally created and sewed every single outfit that her character wears throughout the film, with only one exception. The distinctive polka-dot dress that appears in several key scenes was the only garment provided by the production team, making it the sole piece of official movie costuming in her entire wardrobe. This meant that when viewers watched Diawana getting dressed for work, walking through the streets of Dakar, or suffering through her daily routine in the French apartment, they were seeing clothes that Diop had carefully designed and constructed herself. This arrangement perfectly exemplified the resourceful filmmaking methods that director Ousmane Sembène was forced to use throughout the production. Rather than hiring a costume designer and purchasing or renting period-appropriate clothing, the production team simply relied on their lead actress to handle her own wardrobe needs. Diop's professional sewing skills meant that her costumes looked authentic and well-made on camera, even though they cost the production virtually nothing to acquire. The fact that Diop was already working in the textile industry also added an extra layer of authenticity to her performance, since she understood the daily realities of working-class life in Senegal and could bring that genuine experience to her portrayal of Diawana's character. Fact 4. Her family disowned her for acting. Sembène Thérèse Diop's decision to star in Black Girl created a devastating personal crisis that eerily mirrored the isolation and rejection her character would experience on screen. When director Ousmane Sembène first approached Diop about taking the lead role in his film, her family was absolutely horrified by the idea and made their disapproval crystal clear from the very beginning. In 1960s Senegal, acting was not considered a respectable profession for women, and Diop's family viewed her interest in cinema as shameful and inappropriate for someone from their social background. The situation became so tense that Sembène himself had to personally visit Diop's family to try to convince them that the film project was legitimate and worthwhile. Even after this direct intervention from the director, Diop's relatives remained firmly opposed to her participation in the movie, creating enormous pressure for her to abandon the opportunity. Despite Sembène's efforts to reassure her family about the artistic and cultural importance of the project, they continued to view her involvement as a betrayal of their values and expectations. Once Diop made the final decision to accept the role and begin filming, the consequences in her personal life became even more severe. Not only did her immediate family actively scorn her choice, but her entire neighborhood turned against her as well. The people who had known her throughout her life suddenly treated her as an outcast, whispering about her behind her back, and making her feel unwelcome in the community where she had grown up. This real-life rejection created a painful parallel to the story she was telling on camera, where her character Diawana also experienced isolation and alienation after leaving her familiar environment. The irony was striking because while Diop was helping to create a groundbreaking work of African cinema that would eventually gain international recognition and respect, the people closest to her saw only shame in her decision to participate in this historic project. Fact 5. The voice you hear isn't hers. When audiences watch Sembène Thérèse Diop deliver her haunting performance as Diawana in Black Girl, they're actually hearing the voice of a completely different actress named Toto Bessante, who provided all of the French dialogue through post-production dubbing. This wasn't an artistic choice, but rather a practical necessity that arose from the unique circumstances of how and where the film was made. Since Black Girl was shot almost entirely in Senegal using local actors and crew members, the production team faced significant challenges when it came to creating dialogue that would work for international audiences. Diop, who was a seamstress by profession rather than a trained actress, spoke her native Wolof language and some French, but her accent and pronunciation weren't considered suitable for the film's intended French-speaking audience. Director Ousmane Sembène needed the movie to be accessible to viewers in France and other French-speaking countries if he wanted to achieve his goal of bringing African cinema to international attention. This meant that the dialogue had to sound natural and clear to native French speakers, which required bringing in a professional voice actress who could deliver the lines with the proper accent and intonation. Toto Bessante, who provided Diop's voice, was an experienced performer who understood how to convey emotion and meaning through vocal delivery alone. She had to watch Diop's physical performance carefully, and then match her own vocal interpretation to the subtle facial expressions and body language that Diop had created during filming. This process of dubbing was particularly challenging because Bessante needed to capture the growing desperation and isolation that Diop portrayed so powerfully through her physical acting. The dubbing work was done during post-production, which meant that audiences around the world experienced a performance that combined Diop's compelling visual acting with Besant's skilled vocal interpretation, creating a unique collaborative effort between two different artists. Fact 6. The real newspaper was a film prop. Director Ousmane Sembène made one of the most unusual prop choices in film history when he decided to include the actual 1958 newspaper clipping that had originally reported Diouana Gomez's real suicide as a physical prop within his fictional movie. This wasn't a recreation or a fake newspaper created by the props department, but rather the genuine article that Sembène had saved from 8 years earlier when he first read about the tragic incident that would inspire his film. The newspaper clipping appears in a brief but significant scene where the camera shows a close-up of the headlines reporting Diouana's death, creating a strange moment where reality and fiction intersect directly on screen. This decision represented much more than just an interesting filmmaking choice because it essentially embedded the source material for the entire story right into the movie itself. When audiences saw that newspaper on screen, they were looking at the exact same piece of paper that had first brought this tragic story to public attention, making the connection between the real events and Sembène's adaptation incredibly direct and powerful. The newspaper clipping came from Le Nice Matin, a regional French daily that had covered the story as part of their Faits Divers section, which was typically reserved for brief sensational news items. Sembène's use of this authentic document served as a form of evidence within his film, proving to viewers that the story they were watching wasn't entirely fictional, but was rooted in actual events that had been documented by the French press. The inclusion of the real newspaper also highlighted how dismissively the original tragedy had been treated by the media, since the actual coverage was reduced to just a few lines without any deeper investigation into the circumstances that had led to Diouana's despair. By showing this authentic piece of journalism within his artistic work, Sembène was essentially holding up a mirror to the way French society had failed to properly acknowledge or understand the human cost of colonial attitudes. Fact 7. Cast through a random photograph. The casting of Mbissine Thérèse Diop as the lead in Black Girl happened through one of the most unlikely series of events in film history, involving a completely random photograph that changed the course of African cinema forever. A photographer who worked at Actualités Sénégalaises, which was a Senegalese news agency, was simply doing his regular job when he happened to take a picture of Diop during what appears to have been a routine assignment or street photography session. This wasn't a modeling shoot or an audition photo, but rather just one of many pictures that photographers take during their daily work, without knowing whether the images will ever be used for anything important. Director Ousmane Sembène came across this photograph entirely by chance, while he was presumably looking through materials at the news agency, possibly researching for his film or handling other business related to his work as a writer and filmmaker. Something about Diop's face in that random photograph immediately caught Sembène's attention, and he felt that she had the right look and presence for the character of Diouana that he was trying to bring to life on screen. Rather than continuing with a traditional casting process involving auditions and screen tests, Sembène decided to track down this unknown woman based solely on that single photograph. The fact that Sembène was able to locate Diop and convince her to take the role represents an incredible stroke of luck for both the director and the future of African cinema. If that photographer had walked down a different street that day, or if Sembène had never seen that particular photograph, or if Diop had been unavailable or uninterested in acting, the entire history of Black Girl could have been completely different. This chance encounter between a random photograph and a director's vision ultimately led to one of the most important performances in African film history, proving that sometimes the most significant artistic discoveries happen through pure accident rather than careful planning. Fact 8. Only script ever rejected for content. Ousmane Sembène's screenplay for Black Girl holds the dubious distinction of being the only script in the entire history of France's Ministry of Cooperation's Cinema Bureau to be rejected based purely on its subject matter rather than technical or financial concerns. This government agency was responsible for providing funding to French-speaking African filmmakers during the 1960s, and they typically evaluated projects based on budget requirements, production feasibility, and artistic merit. However, when Sembène submitted his script about a Senegalese domestic worker's tragic experience in France, the ministry officials took one look at the story's powerful anti-colonial message and immediately decided it was too controversial to support with public funds. The Ministry of Cooperation's Cinema Bureau had been established to encourage filmmaking in former French colonies, but their rejection of Sembène's project revealed the limits of what French authorities were willing to tolerate when it came to artistic criticism of colonial attitudes. The screenplay's unflinching portrayal of racism, exploitation, and the psychological damage inflicted on African workers by their French employers was apparently considered too provocative for a film that would receive official French government backing. This rejection forced Sembène to completely rethink his funding strategy and search for alternative sources of money to make his movie. The irony of this situation was that the very government agency that was supposed to be supporting African voices in cinema was actually censoring those voices when they became too critical of French behavior and attitudes. Sembène's rejection by the ministry perfectly illustrated the ongoing tensions between France's official policy of supporting African culture and their reluctance to fund projects that might make French audiences uncomfortable about their country's colonial legacy. This forced rejection ultimately pushed Sembène toward the ultra-low-budget filmmaking methods that would define his career, proving that sometimes official obstacles can lead to more creative and authentic artistic solutions than traditional funding sources would have allowed. Fact 9. The director appears as a pipe. Smoking scribe. Director Ousmane Sembène decided to make a memorable cameo appearance in his own film Black Girl, stepping in front of the camera to play a pipe-smoking scribe in a scene that occurs near the end of the movie. This appearance happens during the sequence where Monsieur, the French employer, travels back to Dakar, Senegal to return Diawana's belongings to her family after her tragic suicide. Sembène appears as a local scribe who helps Monsieur navigate the unfamiliar streets and locate Diawana's family home, making his presence both practical to the story and symbolically meaningful. The choice to include himself in the film was inspired by legendary director Alfred Hitchcock, who famously made brief appearances in nearly all of his movies as a kind of artistic signature. However, Sembène's cameo served additional purposes beyond just following Hitchcock's example, since this was his very first feature film, and he was working with mostly non-professional actors who had never appeared in a movie before. By putting himself directly into the action, Sembène was able to provide extra confidence and support to his cast members during what was already a groundbreaking and historically significant production. Sembène is easily recognizable in the scene because of his distinctive pipe, which was apparently a constant companion that he carried with him throughout his daily life and filmmaking career. The pipe became almost like a trademark for the director, and audiences who knew about his work could spot him immediately when he appeared on screen. This cameo also represented Sembène's deep personal connection to the story he was telling, since he wasn't just directing from behind the camera but was literally inserting himself into the narrative as a character who helps bridge the gap between the French and Senegalese worlds that the film explores. The appearance demonstrated his hands-on approach to filmmaking and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to make his vision come to life. Fact 10. First African film to win prestigious prize. When Black Girl won the Prix Jean Vigo in 1966, it achieved something that no African film had ever accomplished before, breaking through a barrier that had seemed impossible to cross in the world of international cinema. The Prix Jean Vigo was one of France's most respected film awards, established in 1951 to honor young directors who demonstrated exceptional independent spirit and stylistic originality in their work. This wasn't just any film prize, but rather an award that had previously been given to some of the most celebrated names in European cinema, including Jean-Luc Godard for Breathless and Alain Resnais for Night and Fog, making Sembène's victory all the more remarkable. The award was created to pay tribute to Jean Vigo, a legendary French filmmaker who had died tragically young, but left behind influential works that changed the direction of cinema forever. The prize specifically looked for films that showed inventiveness, originality, and intellectual independence, which meant that the judges were seeking out directors who were willing to challenge conventional filmmaking approaches and explore new artistic territories. For an African filmmaker working with almost no budget and using completely unconventional production methods to win this prestigious recognition represented a seismic shift in how the international film community viewed cinema from Africa. Sembène's victory put African cinema on the international map in a way that had never happened before, proving that powerful storytelling and innovative filmmaking could emerge from anywhere in the world, regardless of the resources available to the filmmakers. The award ceremony itself became a historic moment, with footage still existing of Sembène accepting the prize and speaking about his work to French television audiences. This recognition opened doors for future African filmmakers, and helped establish the legitimacy of African voices in international cinema, showing that the continent had stories worth telling, and artists capable of telling them with world-class skill and vision. Fact 11. The mask fight scene was deeply symbolic. One of the most powerful and carefully planned moments in Black Girl occurs when Diawana and her French mistress engage in a physical tug-of-war over an African mask, with both women gripping the object tightly as they circle around each other in the apartment. Director Ousmane Sembène deliberately designed this scene as a visual representation of the much larger cultural struggle between French colonial attitudes and African identity, making the mask itself a symbol that carries far more meaning than just a simple household decoration. The physical fight between the two women becomes a dramatic way to show the deeper conflict that has been building throughout the entire film. The African mask had appeared earlier in the movie when Diawana first gave it to her employers as a gift during her happier days working for them in Dakar, Senegal. At that time, the French family placed the mask among other pieces of African art in their collection, treating it as an exotic curiosity rather than understanding its cultural significance. However, when they moved to France and hung the mask alone on a white wall in their apartment, it became an isolated reminder of Diawana's displacement from her homeland, much like how she herself had become isolated and alone in the unfamiliar French environment. Sembène used the mask to represent Diawana's connection to her African heritage and identity, which was being slowly stripped away by her experiences as a domestic worker in France. When she tries to reclaim the mask near the end of the film, she's essentially fighting to recover a piece of herself that has been taken and displayed like a trophy by her employers. The struggle over the mask becomes a moment where all the cultural tensions and power imbalances that have been building throughout the story finally explode into direct physical conflict, showing how colonial relationships often involve the literal theft of cultural artifacts and spiritual connections. Fact 12. Angela Davis praised it in 1981. 15 years after Black Girl first appeared in theaters, the film received one of its most significant endorsements from Angela Davis, the renowned civil rights activist, scholar, and former Black Panther, who had become one of the most important voices in discussions about racial justice and workers' rights. In 1981, Davis specifically cited Sembène's film in her academic and activist writing, praising it for what she described as brilliantly capturing the tragic predicament of domestic workers around the world. This recognition from such a prominent figure in the civil rights movement demonstrated that the movie's impact had extended far beyond the world of cinema and into serious political and social discourse. Davis's praise was particularly meaningful because she was writing about domestic work as part of her broader analysis of how racism and economic exploitation intersected to create particularly harsh conditions for women of color in service jobs. Her endorsement of Black Girl showed that she viewed Sembène's film not just as entertainment or art, but as an important piece of evidence that helped explain the real-world experiences of countless domestic workers who faced similar forms of discrimination and abuse. Davis understood that the story of Diawana represented much more than just one individual's tragedy, but rather illuminated the systematic problems that affected domestic workers across different countries and cultures. The fact that Davis was still referencing and recommending the film 15 years after its release proved that Black Girl had achieved the kind of lasting cultural significance that very few movies ever managed to attain. Her academic endorsement helped introduce the film to new audiences who might not have discovered it otherwise, particularly in American universities and among civil rights organizations where Davis's opinions carried enormous weight and influence. This recognition also demonstrated how African cinema could contribute valuable perspectives to ongoing discussions about labor rights, racial justice, and the legacy of colonialism in contemporary society. Fact 13. The director learned filmmaking at 40. Ousmane Sembène was already 40 years old when he decided to completely change his career path and learn how to make movies, which was considered extremely late for someone to enter the film industry even during the 1960s. By that time, he had already established himself as a successful novelist and had worked various jobs, including being a mason, mechanic, construction worker, soldier, docker, and trade union organizer, giving him a wealth of life experiences but absolutely no background in cinema. His decision to pursue filmmaking came after he realized that his books weren't reaching the audiences he wanted to connect with, particularly in Africa, where widespread illiteracy meant that many people couldn't read his written stories. Sembène's path into filmmaking happened through an unexpected opportunity that arose from the political tensions of the Cold War era. The Soviet Union was actively trying to expand its influence across Africa during the early 1960s, and one way they did this was by offering educational scholarships and training programs to promising African intellectuals and artists. When Sembène applied for film training, the Soviets were eager to help him because they saw supporting African filmmakers as a way to build relationships with newly independent African nations and potentially gain allies against Western influence in the region. In 1962, Sembène traveled to Moscow to study cinematography at the famous Gorky Studios, where he spent one intensive year learning the technical skills needed to operate cameras, direct actors, and edit films. The training was highly focused and practical rather than theoretical, which suited Sembène perfectly since he was more interested in getting back to Africa and making movies than spending years studying film theory. When he returned to Senegal at the end of 1962, he brought with him both the knowledge he had gained and an old Soviet camera that would become the foundation for his groundbreaking film career. Fact 14. Runtime. Cut to meet French requirements. Director Ousmane Sembène was forced to make significant cuts to Black Girl in order to comply with strict regulations imposed by the Centre National du Cinéma, which was the French government agency that controlled film distribution and exhibition standards during the 1960s. The agency had specific requirements about film length that determined how movies could be classified and distributed, and Sembène discovered that his original cut was too long to meet their guidelines for the category he needed. This meant that he had to deliberately shorten his film to exactly 1 hour, which became a major creative challenge since he had to remove substantial amounts of footage while still maintaining the emotional impact and narrative coherence of his story. The decision to cut the film wasn't artistic but purely bureaucratic, since Sembène needed French approval to ensure that Black Girl could be properly distributed to international audiences and film festivals. Without meeting the Centre National du Cinéma requirements, his movie would have faced significant obstacles in reaching the broader audience that he desperately wanted to connect with, particularly in France and other French-speaking countries. This bureaucratic constraint forced Sembène to become extremely disciplined about every single scene and shot that remained in the final version of the film. The 60-minute runtime that resulted from these cuts actually ended up creating one of the most tightly constructed narratives in cinema history, with absolutely no wasted moments or unnecessary scenes remaining in the finished movie. Every frame serves a specific purpose in building toward Diawana's tragic fate, and the compressed storytelling creates an intense viewing experience that might not have been possible if Sembène had been allowed to include everything he originally filmed. The forced editing process taught Sembène valuable lessons about the power of concise storytelling that would influence his approach to all of his future films throughout his career. Fact 15. The lead actress disappeared from film. After delivering one of the most haunting and memorable performances in African cinema history, Mbissine Thérèse Diop made the surprising decision to step away from acting and essentially disappear from the film world, creating one of the most intriguing mysteries in movie history. Despite the international recognition that Black Girl received and the critical praise for her powerful portrayal of Diawana, Diop chose to return to her original career in the textile industry, rather than pursue the acting opportunities that her breakthrough performance could have opened up for her. This decision was particularly unusual because her natural talent and screen presence had impressed audiences and critics around the world, suggesting that she could have had a successful career in cinema if she had wanted to continue. Diop did make brief appearances in 2 more films directed by Ousmane Sembène, including Emitai in 1971, but these were minor roles that didn't showcase her abilities in the same way that Black Girl had done. After these limited appearances, she completely withdrew from filmmaking and returned to working with textiles, which had been her profession before Sembène discovered her through that random photograph. For decades, she remained largely out of the public eye and rarely gave interviews about her acting experience or her decision to leave cinema behind. The mystery of Diop's departure from acting has only added to the legendary status of her performance in Black Girl, since audiences know that they're watching something truly special and unrepeatable when they see her on screen. Her decision to walk away from fame and recognition makes her portrayal of Diawana feel even more authentic and powerful, as if she understood the weight of the story she was telling and chose to honor it by not treating her acting career as just another job. In 2020, she made a rare return to cinema with a small role in the controversial film Cuties, proving that she was still alive and occasionally willing to act, but her legendary status remains built on that single, unforgettable performance from 1966.